The story we read and sang is referred to as the Transfiguration. It's the story in the lectionary right before Ash Wednesday. Before we go into the perhaps more somber, darker time of Lent, we have the story of Jesus being on the mountaintop and having a sort of mountaintop experience with his disciples, 3 of his disciples anyway. Well, I want to start by telling you about one of my favorite mountains. The conference center on one of my favorite mountains is called Eagle Eyrie. If you've been to Crosswind Camp and Conference Center, this is basically Virginia's Crosswind, okay? It's the Baptist Camp and Conference Center where many different church groups have their retreats and conferences. And I went there many times, especially during college. Now, I didn't include any pictures that give you kind of a wide view of it, but it literally is on a mountain. You're on the side of a mountain. So it's a very, very beautiful setting, unless, of course, you're having to do the walk up to your cabin. Then you might be complaining a little bit, because you are on a mountain. And I must say that I had several mountaintop experiences at this camp and the number of things that I did there. This is the worship center. It's a very long building like this, and there's a stage, and people kind of circle around it. And I've led workshops there. I've helped lead worship there. I've run tech there. I've planned conferences. I've gone to conferences. One time, before I was going to spend a summer as a youth minister, I went there to get training on how to be a youth minister, which I needed at age 19. So that was one of my spots. I loved it. I loved going there. And so naturally, when I went to seminary and I was still in Virginia and I became a campus minister, I was a campus minister for 2 years, I naturally wanted to take those college students with me to Eagle Eyrie so that they could have my experience, right? And I tried to get them very excited about it and pumped up. You have to come to this place. It's so wonderful. You're going to meet God. You're going to have this wonderful experience. And they weren't as excited about it as I was. And I couldn't get them as excited as I was. But they went, and then the ones that went, their experience was different. They weren't doing things right. It wasn't the Eagle Eyrie way, you know. Up at the very top of the mountain, there's a cross. Literally at the very top, you have to walk all the way up. There's a cross with a fire pit and benches and things like that. And I had several wonderful, worshipful moments up there at the top of that mountain at that cross. Literal mountaintop experience. And so while I'm there with my college students that I'm ministering to, I said, let's hike all the way up the mountain to go worship at that cross. Think they wanted to? They weren't getting it, right? This is a great place. They weren't, it just wasn't where I was with it. Well, we have these experiences that we try to preserve, perhaps put in a bottle, where we try to preserve these things somehow and try to share them with others. But maybe it's the way we've preserved them, or maybe it's the way we're holding on to them that's keeping something from happening. I kind of like the image of putting things in a bottle because, if you do manage to get things in a bottle, you really can't get it out unless you break the bottle, right? That's one way to think of it. I once heard of, a man who would, the way you get boats in these bottles, by the way, is you put the boat in folded flat, and then you kind of pull a string, and it lifts up and expands in the bottle. But then after that, it's in there for good. And so I think there are ways that we try to preserve the high points of our lives. But then what happens when we expect it to be the same for others, or we can't get it back. We want to go back, but we can't. And we actually end up being disappointed with these things surrounding the high moments of our lives. I think there are a number of ways we try to preserve the high points, bottle them up, and keep them. You know, these conferences are a good example. The conferences that I went to, the inspirational speakers that you can go and hear, you know, usually it's at least a couple times a year where someone goes to a conference or reads a book or does something like that, and it just changes their life, and they come back to me and tell me about it. One time we had someone who went to a conference somewhere out west, and it changed their life, and so then what did they want to do? Get everybody else to go. Come on, get in the van, right? I had this wonderful experience, so you can too. Let's go. I'm going to take you out there so you can experience the same thing I did. And of course, they're met with the same reaction I got with Eagle Eyrie. Or, you know, the books we read or the things that happen to us that we try to preserve in the way that we experience them and say to someone else, here, you have it too. And it doesn't necessarily work that way. One time someone came back from a conference, and when they were all excited about what they learned and what was talked about, I said, well, tell me what you talked about. And it was all of the same stuff that we teach at church. But we just didn't have the effects for the high moment, I suppose. You know? Or consider today, now, you know, this is me preaching to myself too. Now that we have smartphones, at least some of us do, I know some of you still use the dumb phones, as they call them. Now that we have smartphones, you can just whip it out and take a picture of anything at any time. And potentially there's not a moment in life that you have to miss if you want to capture it with your smartphone. So we can more instantly capture the look on that baby's face, or what we had for breakfast, or all the things that you see that are shared on the internet. The interesting thing about this, though, is that they recently did a study. Some psychologists decided to take two groups of people to a museum. They're going to take the same two groups of people through the museum, except one group, they told them, use your smartphones liberally, take as many pictures as you want, not necessarily smartphones, but take as many pictures as you want. And then the second group, they said, keep your cameras and your phones in your pocket. And they took them on the same tour. Which group do you think remembered more of the museum? The ones not taking pictures. Isn't that interesting? We try to capture it, and yet maybe this thing is what's blocking us from experiencing and being present in the moment. They gave him a test afterwards. What was this painting? Where was this? What did you see? And by far, the people who were not taking pictures remembered the experience better. Or, you know, there are a number of other examples we could do, and I almost didn't throw this one in, but I do a lot of work with couples, premarital counseling, and that kind of thing. And there is a sense in which sometimes the marriage, the wedding, might be a subconscious attempt to bottle and preserve the romance phase of the relationship, right? We are so in love, and maybe sometimes by marrying we can make that last. I'll never forget one couple who came to me, a couple from outside the church, who came to me because their relationship was in trouble, and the woman said to me, we need you to help us or we're not going to make it to our wedding day. Those were her words, and I found that fascinating because in her mind, I suppose, the wedding was the finish line, or it was the point at which you could preserve the best of what the relationship is now. But of course, as we all know, it goes up and down and sideways and backwards and who knows what else. But it's human nature. We want to preserve the high points when we hit them. This is a mosaic of the transfiguration scene that we read about in the Bible. And in the transfiguration story, we have a moment where Peter, who's the one to always speak up, wants to do some preservation, wants to freeze the moment and say, let's camp out here. He says, let's pitch tents. When Jesus, and he's glowing, and they saw Moses and they saw Elijah in the story, and Peter says, let's pitch tents. Let's stay here. Let's preserve it. I like this. This is better than all the crud we were dealing with down there at the bottom of the mountain. We got to preserve this. Now, the Transfiguration story should bring up some things in your mind from earlier in the Bible. Of course, Moses and Elijah showed up, but there's a lot of parallels to their story. In Exodus, you remember Moses was on Mount Sinai with God, and a cloud was covering them, and God spoke with Moses, and he came down with the Ten Commandments, and his face was glowing. And we're supposed to remember that when we read the Transfiguration. Or the story of Elijah, when, not the one we read, but the one where he goes to the mountaintop, and God says, I'm going to pass by, and there's an earthquake and fire and wind, but it says God was in none of those. God was in the gentle whisper. We're supposed to be thinking about that when we read this story. And the Bible seems to like mountains, which is okay with me because I like mountains. That works for me. And so we get to the Transfiguration story, and Peter says to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And the Mark passage says he did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Another gospel is a little bit meaner to Peter. It says he was out of his mind. He had no idea what he was saying, right? But let's camp out. Pitch a tent on this mountaintop. The Elijah and Elisha story is fascinating because here you have Elijah is the older one, and Elisha is kind of his prodigy. You know, he's bringing him up, he's discipling him. And they're having this conversation, and Elijah is traveling to a couple different places, and Elisha says, I'm going with you. He tells him to stay, but he says, I'm going to follow you, even if I have to leave something behind here. My possessions, friends, family, I might have to leave something behind, but I'm going with you. And of course, it's funny because the first 2 places they go, it says the company of the prophets came to Elisha, and they say, you know that today the Lord is going to take your master from you, right? And Elisha says to them, yes, I know, so be quiet. Think of your senior year of high school when people say to you, you know we're graduating this year, and you go, shh, we don't talk about that, right? I don't want to graduate. It's kind of like that. But Elijah keeps going to the next place, refuses to stay. And then closer to the end, Elijah says to Elisha, tell me what I can do for you before I'm taken from you. And Elisha says, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. Now here's what that means. That's inheritance language. Back in those days, your firstborn son got twice the inheritance of the other younger brothers. And so that's what he's asking for. A double portion is the firstborn's share. And so he's asking for favored status. But really he's saying something quite powerful. He's saying, just make me half the man that you were. That's essentially what he's asking for. If I can just do half of what you were able to do, if I can just have half of you come with me, then I'll be okay. I'll continue the journey. And so, instead of asking to preserve it, pitch a tent, he says, I'll take my share of this blessing. Give me my share, and I'll take it on the journey with me. Give me my share, and I'll take it down the mountain with me. See, they had to go back down. And what's fascinating about the Transfiguration story is that it appears in 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But then, all 3 times, the same story follows it in all 3 Gospels. Now, if you've done a lot of Bible study, you know how rare that is. The different Gospels arrange stories in different ways. But in 3 Gospels, the Transfiguration is followed by the same next story every time. And the next story is the demon-possessed boy. Well, welcome back. Right? Mountaintop experience, come down, back to work. And that was actually the purpose, one of the purposes of having that mountaintop moment. They wanted to preserve it. Peter wanted to stay. But the purpose of it was, I'll take this, I'll take my share. I take this blessing, I receive this blessing, and then here I go to the next spot. Because as I work my way down the mountain, there's going to be somebody down there who needs what I was just given. And it's not going to go my way. It's not going to be like your experience at Eagle Eyrie is going to be exactly my experience at Eagle Eyrie. But I receive my blessing up on the mountain of Eagle Eyrie, and I go and I say, there are other people I'm going to meet with their own struggles, their own journey, and I've been given this to pass on to them. Not to keep, not to shelter, not to preserve, but to receive and give freely. Remember that part of the Bible? Freely you have received, freely you must give. The way God blesses us might not be the way God blesses the next person that we meet. And unfortunately, as fun and joyful and reinvigorating a mountaintop experience is, we were never meant to stay. We were never meant to camp out. God has something that He's given us that somebody else, as soon as we get down the mountain, might need. Immediately after they came down, they met the demon-possessed boy. Right back to the problems, right back to confronting evil, right back to the daily grind. But God had given them what they needed to continue. Not to be preserved or kept, but to be taken with them and freely given. I want you to think about your own mountaintop experiences. And whether it was at church camp or not, God gave you something. We have those moments, as short as they might be, where God gives us something that kind of refuels us for what's ahead. What have you been given? The last time life was good, or the last time you felt close to God. The question is not just what did it do for me, but what was God giving me in order to make it through the next valley and in order to share it with the people I might encounter. Bebo Norman sings a song called Walk Down This Mountain. And in the chorus he says, walk down this mountain with your heart held high, following the footsteps of your Maker. With this love that's gone before you and these people at your side, if you offer up your broken cup, you will taste the meaning of this life. Walk down this mountain with your heart held high. God has given you a gift for yourself and for others.